Thank you very much. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves in a second. I thought I would use the moderator's prerogative to make just a couple of opening remarks in terms of trying to set some context. So, there's a lot of potential food applications of CRISPR, which we just saw some of here. We've heard some yesterday, and we'll hear more about today. Applications aimed at nutrition, at food safety, at environmental impacts of agriculture, at food security more broadly, animal health and welfare. The possibilities seem limitless, or I guess as we should say, the limits are limited. But there's also a context that we have to think about this in, right? So clearly part of that is a growing global population. We'll have to feed more than 9 billion people by 2050. Many more of them will be living in cities than do now, and some 2 billion more will be added to what we would think of as a global middle class, which clearly changes people's the way people consume food and their diets, right? So people will be eating more away from home, eating more prepared foods, and presumably, if current trends continue, a diet with more protein, most of that coming from animals. That's also in a context of limited global resources, right? So agriculture is, depending on food and forestry, depending on how you count, is responsible for roughly a quarter or a third of all greenhouse gas emissions globally, and the vast majority of fresh water uses, right? So, but this panel is really, as we said, it's about social acceptance, and if we edit it, will we eat it? So there's also a context of, I think, an increasing consumer interest, maybe predominantly in the Western developed world, but I think it's really a global trend in food more generally, in food values, in governance, in equity in food systems, and in production technologies. So that's also really the context that we're going to be talking about CRISPR and gene editing and technology in food more generally. Like the last panel, I'm going to try to encourage some conversation, some dialogue among the panelists here. We clearly don't have all the perspectives that one would like to have in talking about global food systems. We're quite Western and quite white. But I do want to have an opportunity for at least the people in this audience to hear the different perspectives that we do bring to this conversation. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and not only just to sort of say where you're from and what you do, but a little bit on sort of what are the goals, values, and kind of the principles that you bring to this conversation about food, CRISPR, and social acceptability. So we'll start here and go around.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Michael Krasny. My name is Paul Shapiro with the Humane Society of the United States, the largest animal welfare organization both in the country and in the world. Did you know that according to an Oklahoma State University poll, 80% of Americans want any food containing DNA to be labeled and disclosed? Not a joke, it's a real study. And of course, in this audience, we all know that virtually every food that humans have ever eaten has DNA, maybe with some exceptions like salt. But for the most part, our food contains DNA. And so when we think about the title of this session, will they eat it? What will consumers think about it? Will there be social acceptance? I think we should keep in mind that most people are just not that familiar with science. That's, of course, a double-edged sword. So in the animal welfare world, we have what we call the principle of animal welfare conservation, which is that any biotech or any technology at all that is going to be applied to the animals, let's say in our food system, ought to at least not reduce the animal's welfare. It ought to at least not make them suffer more than they already do. Hopefully it can make them suffer less. And so you can imagine certain CRISPR and other biotechnologies that, for example, might be very good for animal welfare. So one example that's highly touted is gene-edited cattle who don't have horns. Dehorning cattle is very painful for them. You have to cut their horns out of their cranium. No painkiller is administered routinely. And so cattle who don't have to be dehorned could be an animal welfare improvement. Similarly, you could detect in ovo the sex of a chick so that you don't have to bring so many chicks into the egg industry, half of whom are male, and just get ground alive on the first day of their life because they're of no economic value to the industry. But you can use some of these technologies to detect the sex of the chick in ovo after the first day of lay and then divert those eggs into the food system. On the other hand, you could have real negative implications for animal welfare. You could, for example, imagine editing cattle to have double muscling, where you have these cattle like Belgian Blues and others who have, they really reflect more Arnold than Bessie. And so you can have that type of an effect that's very bad for animal welfare too, and we can get into that later. The final point of my introduction I'll also note about myself is that I am publishing a book somewhat on this topic in January with Simon & Schuster on the new technology that is typically referred to as clean meat, which is growing real animal meat without the animals. This is not veggie burgers. This is not plant-based meats. This is taking a cell from an animal and growing that meat without the animal at all. When Michael talks about feeding the population of 2050 of 9 to 10 billion people with a diet that's higher in meat than what most people are eating today, it's hard to imagine doing that with our current animal agricultural system, which is extremely inefficient. One way to improve efficiency will be to go toward these, instead of going big, as some in agriculture have gone, it might be to go small with cellular agriculture. So we can talk about that more later, but I'm grateful to be here. I'm thankful to the organizers, Keystone, and everyone else for having me, and I really look forward to a panel conversation with my esteemed panelists.
Thanks. Cassie?
Great. So my name is Cassie Edgar, and I'm Chief IP and Regulatory Officer at Genus PLC. We're a company based outside of London in the UK, traded on the FTSE 250, and operate through subsidiary companies here in the US, PIC, and we have a few folks here from that organization, and ABS. And our mission is improving animal genetics to help nourish the world. So in terms of the values that we bring to the table around this technology, I'll talk about three things specifically. Responsibility, it's one of our core values, and we're committed to the responsible development of this technology. Roxy mentioned yesterday the Center for Food Integrity's Coalition for Gene Editing. We're a founding member of that coalition. I participate on the Responsible Use Guidelines Task Force, and we want to be a thought partner and a leader in this space in ensuring that this technology is used responsibly. Just because you could do it doesn't mean that you should do it. The second point is transparency. So consumers have a right to choice in the marketplace, and when we're making purchasing decisions, as we all do at the grocery store, we want to know not only what we're buying, but how the animals were raised, what was the animal welfare, what those animals were fed. Was this from a local farm, or was this something that was shipped in from Scotland or something else, and let's consider the sustainability of the food choices that we're making. So we're very committed to transparency. The third point is the importance of a working regulatory system. And especially with the new technologies such as gene editing, this is really in nascent stages and it isn't fully developed. And I'm sure that we'll talk about this in more detail, and there's also a panel discussion later that will get into this topic in a lot of detail. But for gene editing, right now with animals, that's considered a new animal drug, and the FDA is regulating this. So making sure that we have a predictable, working regulatory system to move this technology through, and also the importance of a global harmonized system. Because as in the grain industry, with livestock, if you're growing animals in the US, they don't stay in the US. They go to key export markets. And we need, relating to this core value of responsibility, to ensure that we have all the approvals in place for the farmers and the producers to be able to send these products to key export markets leaving the United States. And finally, the concept of inclusion and having a dialogue with stakeholders is also critically important. So I want to thank the organizers for having me on the panel. Looking forward to hearing your perspective and having a discussion on this topic.
Thanks. Tom?
Good morning. So I'm the other farmer named Tom.
Yeah, we're wildly overrepresented in farmers named Tom in particular.
They're all named Tom. We're involved. We're up to tomfoolery out there with your food system. But I wasn't always that person. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles in a family that couldn't even grow a houseplant. I actually graduated from this university just a few years ago, to be more honest about it, in 1970, as a sociologist. And after trying to reform miscreants in the prison and parole system for a few years, I began to be overwhelmed by a rather sour outlook on the human race. And it kind of drove me to the soil for therapy. And so I've had a 40-some-year career in both conventional and organic agriculture. I headed for the San Joaquin Valley of the state of California here, which is about 3 hours to the east of here, because I'd heard it was the most productive agricultural real estate on the planet Earth, and it is that. And so I worked there for others for some years, and then my wife and I started T&D Willey Farms in 1981, started experimenting with organic methods. Soon thereafter, in 1987, became certified organic. We have just retired a couple of months ago from a 30-year career in certified organic diversified vegetable production. I thoroughly enjoyed my career growing food for others, and probably because of our involvement in the organic sector, I made a pretty good living at it. However, I have come to agree with Jared Diamond's characterization of the invention of agriculture as the worst mistake in the history of the human race. I'm not a self-loathing farmer, but agriculture introduced inequality, both amongst classes of people and the sexes. It vastly diminished the diversity of our diets, and the grain-based diets that we all consume these days are responsible for a lot of chronic degenerative disease that plagues our population and threatens to destroy our economy. What I have learned in organic agriculture is that we need to evolve agriculture to greater harmony with the natural systems of the planet Earth, which need to be our teacher and our model. I think we've made a few baby steps in that direction in our working with organic agriculture and the organic movement in the last 40 years, but those are just baby steps. As far as the CRISPR technology, I describe myself as a critical middle of the rotor on the potential adoption of this technology, or this technology's ability to help us go towards a more ecological agriculture that we need to achieve in order to consider agriculture sustainable. If it follows the model of the previously introduced genetically modified crops, that first generation of crops has been a failure in its ability to head us in a more ecological direction for agriculture, and it also has not really enhanced the quality of food for the people who eat it. It's been a convenience item for farmers, and it's been a profit center for a few large corporations. Those are my short perspectives.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Randy.
Well, so thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm Randy Cheeroo, Vice President with Cargill. For folks who don't know, Cargill is a 151-year-old family company. It still is a private company today. We operate across the agricultural supply chain in about 67 countries and do business in about another additional 30 countries. I look at this technology, and I'm going to back up a little bit and just talk about, what is if you think about from Cargill's perspective, we think a lot about agriculture. We are an agricultural company, and when producers thrive, we thrive. And so when we look at agriculture, it has been driven by innovation, right? And I mean innovation in the broadest sense, right? Whether it be the plow, whether it be cultivation, whether it be domestication, of agricultural products, our ability as humanity to capture sunlight, store that energy in a way that we then turn around and transform it into food or feed, fuel, fiber, bioindustrial products. This is fundamental to our civilization. And so it's all innovations in agriculture. We strongly believe that we need innovation in agriculture, all kinds of innovations, not one in particular, not another, but we do have a goal in this world to nourish people and to do it in a way that's responsible, to do it in a way that's sustainable, and do it in a way that's safe. And these underlying principles are what guide the 150,000 employees in Cargill every day. When I talk about food, I always think about it as well from a global food system perspective. Right? Not about US agriculture, but about a global food system. And how do we make sure, and how do we get that system to the place where it's connected and trusted by the end users, who are our consumers, our customers in that market. As Cargill, we talk about customer focus, right? We want to delight our customers. We want to provide them with the things that they want. And Cargill's in a unique position in that we have two customers. So we have the producer customer, the farmer, right, whose bounty we take, try to market, transform into different products, right, and try to enable that farmer to thrive on the farm. But we also have an end-use customer, the consumer in some cases, but also branded food customers who are proxies then for the things that their consumers are looking for in the marketplace. We think about the consumer in many ways, but the three ways we think about it the most is first around coexistence and the ability of consumers to choose the types of things that they want to eat, to buy the values, their personal values as they wish to buy them, and to make sure that people have that right to do that, to coexist with each other and to make different food choices. Secondly is the issue of trust, right? And we talked about the word trust quite a bit yesterday around the food system. We explored what some of those underlying causes are for trust or a growing mistrust in what I'll call the existing food system. And many of the food companies are trying to figure out how to rebuild that trust with consumers. They recognize it and they want to rebuild that trust. And lastly, which is relatively new, has been this democratization of information, the ability of consumers to know everything they want to know, to believe that they have the ability to know and the right to know everything, and that's really raised this issue in the food system around transparency and people wanting to know, where does their food come from, how is it produced, where was it manufactured, how is it manufactured, sometimes just to know out of curiosity, but sometimes to allow them to buy and purchase the types of foods from the types of systems that they're interested in buying from. And so our overall goal in the food system should be to provide access to those types of choices and for folks to be more understanding of where their food comes from and how it's created.
Okay. Thanks, Randy. Last but not least, Dana.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dana Pearls, and I'm here representing Friends of the Earth US. Friends of the Earth is one of the largest environmental networks in the world, in about 74 different countries. We work on a wide variety of issues related to environmental conservation and equity. However, my particular work has been focused on food equity, in particular biotechnology, and what are the impacts on agriculture and our food system. And so in general, we are looking at a food system. We are wanting a food system that is based on transparency, a food system that is truly regenerative, which is truly organic, sustainable, healthy for farmers, for farm workers, for our planet, and for consumers. We haven't used this phrase yet, but we look at a food system which is based on food sovereignty. And that raises questions about food safety, about world hunger. We've heard a lot about how are we going to feed a growing population, when actually there's a robust amount of data that it's important to look at that suggests that hunger is not about how are we needing to grow more food, but actually hunger is based on poverty. Hunger is based on a lack of democracy, a lack of access to land, to water, to credit, to other resources. So as we talk about what do we need to address climate change, well, we need to protect our ecological resources. How are we doing that in this food system? If we want to talk about how do we feed a growing population, then let's talk about poverty, let's talk about democracy, and when we talk about sustainability, let's talk about who are these technologies that we're talking about sustainable for? Are they sustainable for the small vanilla farmer in Madagascar whose product doesn't have a demand because it's been replaced by synthetic biology vanillin? Who is that sustainable for? Do they have the money now to purchase food, or does that go directly to the company seeking the profit? Also, I think it's important that we think about the risks in addition to the benefits. When we talk about the benefits without mentioning the risks and the concerns, then we get into a question of hype. And consumers have had a lot of hype. And I think we'll talk about what we can learn from history. But it's important to look at what the environmental concerns are, whether that's contamination, which is an issue that's being addressed widely at the UN Convention on Biodiversity. What are the contamination risks from genetically engineered algae? What are contamination issues regarding CRISPR? What are the mutations? How do those mutations evolve? What are the unexpected surprises? We know that we don't know that much about genetics, and we have a lot to learn. And so before we can answer, is this sustainable? Is this safe? Is this useful? We need to have robust safety assessments that are appropriate for the technologies we're looking at. Currently, we have 30-year-old regulations that don't answer those questions. We need oversight. We need regulations, not just within the United States, but as it's already been mentioned, this is a global issue. And until and unless we answer those questions, we can't put a halo of sustainability and safety on some of these technologies. So I want to emphasize that. And one last thing that I want to say from the value level for Friends of the Earth, when we talk about these new technologies, we hear a lot of terms like bio-based and fermentation-derived and clean meat and clean labels. And if we're going to talk about transparency, let's actually name what this is. Consumers want to know if something has been genetically engineered. The data is overwhelming. So let's actually call this genetic engineering. And there's a lot of rhetoric to separate ourselves from that because there is a history which has been problematic. But if we're going to be transparent, and if companies are going to race to these new and emerging technologies because they're beneficial, because there's promise, then why not name what it is instead of turning to glossy terms that are confusing and deceiving? So at a value level, we want what's safe, we want what's transparent, and we want what's going to be healthiest for people and the planet. And that is oftentimes things that we already have, like agroecological approaches to farming and food.
Great, thank you. So I know it took a little bit of time, but I thought it'd be good for everyone to hear where everyone's coming from before we dive into the conversation, which let's do now. So a couple of things that have come up in your comments so far. I want to start with a little bit of a, not looking back, but we know that this does take place in the context of a conversation about genetic engineering in food. And we have a 20-year sort of history in terms of conversations about food, biotechnology, and social acceptance. So I guess my first question would be, and I'll throw it out to you first, Randy, but to open it up as well, what, kind of what have we learned over those 20 years, and how does that inform our current conversations and how we think about this moving forward?
Yes, at the highest level, I always think that technology pull is much better than technology push. It's a much more comfortable place to be. I'm envious when I look at things like the iPhone, how you've got something that's just absolutely pulled into the market, and how great would it be if in the space of gene editing, in the space of genetic engineering, we had that same kind of pull by consumers to bring those products into the market. And really try to divine from that, why is that? What is it about some technologies that pull them so aggressively through the system, while in other places we see differences of opinion and different perspectives on the relevance or the importance of that technology. One thing we've seen is a growing skepticism in the food system. I talked about earlier, and that's really, from my perspective, a symptom of eroding consumer trust in that system. Now, the great thing is it can be restored, right? That we can restore, and the food system is looking to restore that trust in the food system, and we do that by listening, by acting, and really understanding the concerns and needs of consumers, and then how do we then use technology in agriculture to look at those needs and then see them pull those products through the market. We talked a lot about consumer confidence yesterday. We talked a lot about consumers. We talked, and what are the pillars we see that are most important. We've heard a few of them on the stage already, right? An assurance of safety.
Yep.
I think in the food system in the United States, that's an expectation that there's safety. And so how do we make sure that there is, for new technologies, a foundation of safety that's unequivocal, right? That it's not an assurance of safety based on just a subsection, a group. So because scientists say it's safe, we shouldn't assume then that consumers are going to think it's safe. And so how do we do that? How do we crack that code with consumers? What do they need to get to that point where they feel that the use of gene editing techniques are safe, and it's off the table? We can take that off the table. Transparency, we've talked a lot about transparency, right? People want to know about their food, and if you can get just about any information you want off your cell phone today, if you can't get some piece of information, then how do consumers think about that? Do they wonder why it's not available? Is there something is being hidden from them, from a transparency around food? And so I think, we've seen it in the food companies. We've seen it. We've talked about it here. This issue of transparency is key. And the last point I make, because we're a global food company, we think that there's a key role for the global food system is a certain degree of regulatory coherence, so that unlike we saw with the first round of biotechnology products, we don't see countries taking very, very different positions around the relative safety of those products, right? Which undermine individual governments' policies and really allow us to integrate this technology into the global food system. If we see it as a value to agriculture, to feeding the population going forward, access to that technology and integration of that technology into agriculture has to happen globally and not just in specific geographies. And so these are the key lessons that we've learned.
Yeah. Other perspectives, Dana, you kind of mentioned, you brought this up too, so anything to add there?
I think it's an interesting concept of the push and the pull. And if we're talking about pulling, then I want to name the elephant in this room, which is that the organic industry is one of the fastest growing parts of our food system. We're looking at nearly $50 billion market, and people are wanting more and more. The Non-GMO Project is looking at 40,000 different brands that are being marketed as non-GMO. So where is the pull? I think from the consumer perspective, what history has shown us is a lot of false promises, a lot of promises that weren't delivered. And those same promises we're hearing again with this next generation, this next round, GMOs 2.0. which is around climate change and drought tolerance and benefits for the consumers. And if we look back at the data, close to 90% of the genetically engineered crops that hit the market were about herbicide tolerance. We talked about using less pesticides, but actually, since 1996, it's gone up hundreds of millions of pounds in terms of the use of herbicides. So there's a disconnect between the promises and what the data show, and consumers are savvy about that. And now, as we're hearing new promises and stories of safety, it raises questions. Are companies really willing to be fully transparent? If consumers and people are asking for third-party assessments and robust regulations that are consistent, are we willing to have mandatory regulations as opposed to self-approved voluntary assessments and regulations? Are we willing to actually do the assessments and be transparent about it? And we're starting to see some of these questions rise to the surface. TerraVia, which was part of Solazyme, came up with the Thrive culinary oil, which is from a symbioalgal oil, and has touted it as sustainable. However, the data about how much feedstock, the feedstock that comes from the GMO corn or the sugar, is behind confidential business information walls. So that transparency question comes up again. How are we supposed to trust this? Recently in the news, you may have seen the story of the Impossible Burger, which has a lot of rhetoric around reducing the demand for animal factory farming, which is very problematic. However, we need real solutions, and for full transparency, Friends of the Earth and ETC Group submitted a FOIA request to find out what was behind the Impossible Burger. And in fact, what we found was that the FDA looked at the data for this genetically engineered protein derived from the soy hemoglobin, which is that kind of magic heme, and found that they couldn't deem it to be safe, that the data provided on safety didn't meet the basic GRAS standards. So here we have a company that's already promoted this as safe and sustainable when the data behind the scenes showed actually the opposite. And so again, we're already starting to see history repeat itself, where we have a promise and then the data shows otherwise.
And I agree with, I think what Dana's saying, I agree. It's a fundamental learning that we need to work toward, and that's in version 1 of everything we did, we were focused on the science. And this is now indicating that we need to focus on the social science, not just the science. And that's why discussions like these are so critically important. It's working with stakeholders to get a social license to utilize this technology, and being transparent and talking about the benefits, and not choosing things that are solely for the benefit of, the focus had been single-handedly on genetics to feed the world and improve well-being of farmers and society, and that's part now of a much bigger, broader equation, including infrastructure and water and other things, like land usage and other things that we're seeing as part of the equation, not just the genetics alone. So I think a key learning is that science is not the single-handed solution. We have to engage social science and work with our stakeholders to talk through those issues.
Great. Other side, you want to jump in?
I'll just tell a quick story that relates, I think, to consumer acceptance of certain products. So in the mid-19th century, there was a very large natural ice industry. This huge spawning industry of people going north, getting icebergs and other naturally formed ice, bringing it down, chopping it into little pieces, giving it to people for their ice boxes in their homes to basically keep meat and produce to keep it fresh longer. So fast forward a few decades and industrial cooling starts taking off. And you don't have people being able to put these machines in their homes yet, but you have big warehouses where water is being cooled down into ice, and it's a big threat to the natural ice industry. And they start referring to it as artificial ice. And so the natural ice industry is very upset. They're campaigning against artificial ice. They're trying to tell people how dangerous it is. You don't want this artificial ice touching your food, or God forbid you put it in your drink to cool it down. The ammonia from the coolant could get in there and sicken you. In reality, though, at the time, because of the Industrial Revolution, the natural ice was dirtier because the artificial ice was being cooled from filtered or boiled water. And now you fast forward, 100 years to the present day, and we all have artificial ice makers in our home. You wouldn't even dream of living in a home without one, and we don't think anything about it at all. And so I think it's illustrative for a couple reasons. One is that what we call things matters. And two, consumers are not always going to be fully cognizant behind the technologies, behind certain products, whether it's ice or in this case food. And I think for those who are the artificial ice makers of today, let's say people who are engaged in biotech food processes, the key is to do things like what artificial ice makers did, which was make sure it actually is safe and then communicate that to the public so there is full transparency about how the ice is being made, why it is safe, and in that case, why it's actually safer than the way it was done before.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to shift or go back to something that came up a little earlier in terms of this, going back to this push and pull, right? And Tom, we heard a little bit about the growth of organic. It appears that consumers are looking for more natural and kind of clean label products, and I think growth of organic is one indication of that. In terms of that community and that community that how do you think that this new technologies like CRISPR could play in that environment?
Well, there's a number of voices here yesterday that were just perceiving the problem as making people comfortable by whatever means necessary with the food system as it exists. But I think we can't pretend that there aren't serious problems with our food system. And I think the growth of the organic marketplace is an indication that people are seeking alternatives to conventional foods. I think science fairly well understands now that we're exposing ourselves to the risk of a tremendous amount of pesticides and toxins in our environment. It's known that every child born in this country anyhow has 200 different chemical derivatives of either agricultural or industrial pesticides in their cord blood. Is that a good thing? I mean, I've got a friend that puts a salt shaker on his dining room table when people come to eat, and he labels it pesticides. And so he invites them to add some to their food if they think that enhances the quality of their food. And that thing always stays full. It never gets emptied. Nobody wants to use it. So, industry is always telling us that, the use of pesticides enhances our food system. And it enhances the single purposeness of having cheaper food and growing it more conveniently on a grander scale with fewer human beings involved in its production. But is it really enhancing the quality of our food? I think, millions of people in the marketplace buying organic foods that are demonstrably less contaminated with pesticide residues are voting with their dollars. And so we have tried as organic growers to respond to that demand, and I think we have done a pretty good job, a better job than I expected we ever could do over about 30 or 40 years of adapting high-yield agriculture to natural systems. People accuse organic of not producing enough food to feed a hungry world, but we have to face the fact that much of the food that we grow in this world we're feeding to animals and only eating secondarily as human beings. So we do have a great abundance of food. We don't necessarily have to totally focus on yield all the time. We need to focus more on quality. We've been trying to do that in the organic business, and I hope I sort of answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's good, thank you. I'm going to throw it open a little more generally, and maybe Randy, you brought this up originally in part because of where you sit in the value chain, thinking about those. What are what are those kinds of traits? What are those things that you're hearing that you from your end user customer that you think are the kinds of things that might pull into the marketplace.
Yeah, just if I may respond a little bit to Tom. So,
Please do.
Let's not talk about agriculture. Agriculture never stops evolving, right? And so I hear a lot about the old agriculture and the new agriculture, but let's recognize as well that even within production agriculture today, it's nowhere near the same that it was 20 years ago. From a yield perspective, from a conservation perspective, things have changed significantly. And secondly, I don't know of a single food company who doesn't strive to sell safe, nutritious, and affordable food, right? And so let's recognize that one important equation for many, many people in the United States is affordability. And I don't believe that people trade off safety for affordability, at least in the United States. And so I think that's important recognition. And I think we need to recognize there are lots of agricultural systems, right? Organic is one agricultural system. Folks who choose to grow conventional crops is a separate agricultural system. And we look at things that are going on in the Midwest Crop Initiative around cover crops, around looking at that microbiome, around more integrated solutions around farming. Those are not exclusively the purview of organic farming. And I think as we continue to see more conventional farming, as we learn more, as we understand the science better, I don't think there's a farmer out there that's not looking and striving to be as sustainable as possible within the context that they operate. When it comes to looking at the traits, I think the biggest challenge, the biggest driver is finding traits that are linked to an understood benefit, right? Within the consumer, that understood benefit. And so the idea that certain technologies have an impact on the farm, right, and translate tangentially to the consumers, we've seen that it needs to be much more overt in terms of the types of traits and products that we bring to the consumer for them to clearly understand how that use of technology is improving their lives, is improving the things they put in their mouths, is doing the things that they're really interested in buying. So there's those hard benefits we talk about around nutrition and health, right? And those things that are very hard. But there's also another soft set of opportunities around things like sustainability, right? And I will say unequivocally, I think agriculture is more sustainable today than it was 20 years ago, conventional agriculture, than it was 20 years ago. And so if we look at other things like animal welfare, right, these are less tangible benefits, but as we've seen people look at the food system, as we've seen consumers want to pull their values through the food system, those benefits around sustainability, those benefits around carbon footprints, those benefits around animal welfare improvements, these are now translating more to consumers. And so how do we use technology not only just for nutrition and health, but also get at some of these soft benefits? And how do we do a good job of communicating and having consumers understand the types of agriculture they either support, that they buy with their wallet, that they support with their wallet, around the traits that they're interested in. And I think we've learned this today, we see this on the panel, there's a wide variety of perspectives on what that is. What is a value driver for me? What is important to me in agriculture? And I think it's important that we recognize people have different needs in the food system, and folks have different wants, and we have to make sure that one person's wants don't overrule somebody's needs.
So Cassie, how do you're in the kind of on the end of trying to figure out, okay, well, what traits are we going to try to put in? So how do you take all this and think about, okay, what traits are you going to focus on, and kind of how do you think about how the food industry more broadly and your company in particular need to be engaging with consumers to address this pull on these social license kinds of issues?
So I'll step back from discussing our company specifically and talk about
Sure.
just the ability of this technology to deliver change to food and agriculture. So, speaking of pull, right? So the University of Illinois researchers developed yeast that when used can increase the amount of resveratrol in wine 10x, and then also change malolactic acid fermentation to decrease the toxins that produce hangovers. So for me personally, the use of CRISPRs in wine sounds like a great trait, especially maybe tonight. But so I think we have to, we were very focused before on production, agriculture benefits, and improving yields, and the consumer as the farmer. For the tech companies delivering genetics. Now, when we look at consumer benefits, we think about who's the consumer. It's the mom in the grocery store, the dad in the grocery store making those purchasing decisions, buying food. And so for our company, animal welfare specifically, we've chosen to go first with a trait that is delivering disease resistance to pigs. And Thomas Titus referenced this yesterday, the PRRS virus, and mentioned that if it impacted his operations, it would shut him down. So we're focusing on using CRISPRs to make a deletion in a particular gene that would make these animals resistant to that disease. And rather than, it grows faster, you can have something like you can feed it less food and it gets bigger quicker. We're choosing to have a trait that is animal welfare and health focused and will deliver healthier, more sustainable animal protein for those who choose to make animal protein part of their dietary choice.
Thanks. So I'm going to shift gears maybe a little bit for one more question, and then we'll probably go in a minute to some questions from the audience. So, so one thing that has come up multiple times is a regulatory system, right? So both from sort of domestically and an international component. There is a panel later today focusing more about governance, so I don't want to get into the details of part whatever of the federal code, but really to sort of think about how do you think about the impact on trust, consumer trust, and the regulatory system, and how do you what are the principles that we need to ensure as we think about the regulations of CRISPR that will both obviously assure safety, but also provide some level of consumer trust to the extent that you believe that consumer trust is impacted by the regulation. So I'm going to throw this out to everyone. Dane, we can start with you, but anyone who also has a view on that.
Thanks. I think it's a really important question, and just to name that, we're talking about this in the context of the United States, but when we talk about regulations, it is really important that we're looking at this in the context of the world. If we're talking about food system that may not be confined to a single corn field, that might mean that we're talking about an algae production site in Brazil that's on a waterway using feedstock from Brazil to replace a product that's grown in Indonesia, right? So let's actually talk about this in the context at the global level. If we're going to talk about it at the level of the United States, we need to look at our very old and outdated regulations that have not yet caught up with the pace of technology. And before we have these technologies like the CRISPR corn or a number of different synthetic biology, genetic engineering applications released into the environment or onto the market, we need to be able to ask a number of questions about safety, about oversight, and about regulations. I think that there needs to be an overhaul of our regulations. Currently, we ask very finite questions. For example, under the USDA APHIS regulations, we talk about plant pests. And that might not actually be the key question anymore. And we're missing a whole bucket of questions that could have implications for our ecosystems, for safety. And so we heard yesterday about the coordinated framework and how in the US we mostly regulate based on the final product. But we're not talking about transgenics right now. We're talking about a bucket of technologies which ultimately are engineering in the process, right? CRISPR and engineering yeast to pump out whatever product you've just designed it for. So If we are now engineering processes, then our regulations need to address the impacts and the implications of the process. Let's look at the production based on a holistic assessment of the entire life cycle. Let's look at sustainability not just as it relates to the root crop, but also sustainability at the socioeconomic level. So I think we need an overhaul of our regulatory system when we raise the question of animals, when we're engineering an entire animal, or we're using CRISPR for the pig. Is that an animal drug? That seems to be a bit outdated. What are the questions that we need to ask about? Is it, if you engineer one portion to address one disease, does that make the animal more susceptible to other diseases? Are any of those diseases transferable to humans? I don't know that our regulations help us answer those questions right now. And until we have answered a number of those safety assessments and sustainability questions, and looking also at the impact at the societal level, that we can't say that something is safe and sustainable and helpful.
Other perspectives, Tom?
We're always dazzled with our, new bag of tricks. It's just the way we are. We always like the new. Because we're, so dazzled right now with our ability to edit genomes and create products this way, we have created the need for a whole lot of effort going into regulation, a lot of public debate. There's a tremendous amount of resources going to how are we going to adopt these new technologies and make them safe. In the meantime, I think we have ignored, the technology and the art that has brought agriculture to its tremendously productive capacity that it is today over the last 10,000 years. And a lot of that was conducted by dumb farmers who had no idea of what genetics or science was or what, but they were using selection, which was the first human to get their head around that was Charles Darwin. And we now know that all of life on this planet evolves through natural selection. And when we decided to do agriculture, we started doing artificial selection. And what that is selecting sexual combinates from a genetically variable population that also keeps introducing new things, both through sexual combination and mutation. Many of the most famous crops that we have, the russet Burbank potato, was just a freak of nature and a very observant plant breeder picked that up and ran with it. So selection, is a really important process. And I'd just like to read a little quote from Bill Tracy, who's a public plant breeder and the chairman of the Department of Agronomy at the University of Wisconsin. He says, the reigning engineering paradigm is in direct opposition to the selectionist paradigm. Engineering suggests that we can find out what all the genes do and then put them together in the optimal way. Selectionists apply selection and let nature and the organism create an array of solutions, any number of which will be useful, some in unique and unexpected ways. So when we're concentrating with the new technology on single gene traits and not using this process of selection, which really has an adaptive capacity to unique environments above and beyond the trait that we're focusing on, we're ignoring that process, and that process is, taken us in 10,000 years from, in the instance of corn, a grass that grew a head of grain about as big as the fingernail on your little finger, to, ears of corn like this, and adapted a tropical grass from southern Mexico or Central America all the way up to New England in a period of 8,000 years. We're talking about engineering drought tolerance into corn, okay? But we already have Hopi corn. That was already developed as a very drought-tolerant subset of corn throughout that process. Now, do we have 8,000 years to wait anymore? We probably don't have 8,000 years. We're going to have to adapt agriculture and evolve agriculture at a faster rate than we ever had because we're facing climate change. So can we marry these technologies, CRISPR, and breeding and selection and traditional breeding? We probably can if we're using it all to go in the right direction. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater on ignoring the natural systems of the earth, which is what's given us the bounty that we have on our tables today. So, thank you.
So I agree with Tom that we don't have 8,000 years to wait, that climate change is already upon us and that we have to take action now. There was a study that came out just about maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago that said that if all Americans switched all of their beef consumption to beans, that the US would nearly reach all of our Paris Climate Agreement requirements just through that one action alone. Now, if you're like me, you don't think that's likely to happen. And so what I would suggest is that we have to get a lot more efficient about how we produce the meat that people want to eat. And one way is through cellular agriculture, growing real animal products like meat, not the Impossible Burger like Dana was talking about, which is a plant-based burger, but this is real meat grown without the animals by taking a biopsy from the animal, proliferating the cells outside of the animal's body, and instead of growing a whole animal, which includes many parts that we don't really want that much, you grow just the parts that we want, like muscle and so on. It's a lot more efficient. And as far as the question about regulation, it's unclear yet who would really regulate this, because it sounds kind of like an FDA thing to regulate, but the USDA regulates meat. They have the Food Safety Inspection Service regulates the meat that's produced. But that framework assumes a slaughterhouse. The USDA inspectors are at the slaughterhouse to monitor animals being slaughtered to ensure that food safety precautions are being taken. Doesn't really apply in this case because most of the pathogens that we're concerned about, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, these are intestinal pathogens. Well, the folks growing clean meat aren't growing intestines, they're growing muscle, so you don't need to worry about those type of pathogens. You have more to worry about your own hands being dirty and touching the meat than you do coming from some fecal pathogen in a slaughter plant. So I do suspect that eventually it'll be the FDA that ultimately regulates these, but so far that hasn't been determined, and things are moving pretty quickly. You know, at the beginning of this decade in 2010, there were no companies that were doing this at all. This is just a fantasy of Winston Churchill in 1931, who wrote an essay predicting that we would be growing meat rather than growing animals to provide us with meat. Now, though, there are many companies around the world, many of them here in the Bay Area, Israel, the Netherlands, and so on, who are producing these clean meats, and some of them are only a few years away from commercialization. So somebody's going to have to regulate it, and it's still unclear who it will be.
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
All right, I want to jump to the audience questions, so we can only have a few minutes left. There's a bunch of questions here. I'm going to kind of mix and match and maybe combine some. But first question on the top here is around first world problems versus developing world problems, right? And which I think goes both ways. The way this question is phrased is how do we make sure that we're not limiting CRISPR deployment because of loud first world voices?
So I'll start. So I'm based in Minneapolis, where Cargill has its headquarters, but I do spend half my life in other parts of the world. And most of those parts of the world are either developing or underdeveloped countries where Cargill operates. And I would say that this debate that we're having here today is not a debate we would have in those countries. Their focus is on food safety. Their focus is on cost. Their focus is on farmer prosperity and productivity. And so talking about CRISPR is really a North American context. And so when they look at technology, they look at technology in ways to solve those problems, to solve the problems of safety, solve the problems of price, and solve the problems around farmer productivity and on-farm profitability of those farmers. And so, once again, it's an issue of coexistence, right? That we should allow different forms of agriculture, different approaches to agriculture, have that opportunity to grow and thrive. You know, it could be 20 years from now, there's another form of agriculture that's the lead horse. We don't know, right? These technologies, genetic engineering is an incredibly powerful technology, and so I aspired as a young man to be a plant molecular biologist. It didn't turn out that way. I ended up getting a PhD in plant molecular biology. I understand the power and the significance of this technology that it brings and the opportunities it brings. And so I would love to see technology in agriculture. It's one of the passions I have. It's one of the reasons I work for the company I work for. But the reality is people see it differently, and we shouldn't try to impose our value system or the way we feel about it on others, and we should let all those technologies and those production opportunities exist and coexist with each other.
Other thoughts on this question?
I think it begs the question to, again, raise the issue of food sovereignty. And we talk a lot about self-determination and what does that mean to feed a growing planet, and what does it mean to feed yourself. And there's data that comes out of the World Health Organization suggesting that the way to feed a growing planet is through small-scale agroecological farming, regenerative farming. And so I think that it is important that we look at who's in the room, who's talking about how do we feed the world, and what is the rest of the world actually doing to feed itself. And when we raise the question of the northern, western, white world making decisions, to really be thinking clearly about what is necessary. And if we're talking about hunger, for example, again, what are the drivers of hunger? Does it come down to something that biotech can solve, or is it actually a question of distribution of resources, access to land and water, poverty, war?
And I don't know that our discussion here and the impact on North America adoption excuse me, would necessarily curtail the application of this technology in other countries. And we haven't gotten to equity, but with the current regulatory system for animal biotech in the US requiring a full FDA approval, just as a pharmaceutical, there's a pyramid of data requirements from molecular characterization, genotypic durability, phenotypic durability, and environmental assessment, food safety assessment throughout the whole development life cycle. That takes millions of dollars and multiple years. And so the adoption of this technology in the US is going to be limited to the people who can ramp up the staff and have the financial fortitude to make that investment. That's not necessarily going to be the case in other countries. So we may see that some technologies move and develop, and innovation dollars and investments will go elsewhere to solve those problems.
Sorry, I'm going to jump to another question. How much more time do we got? 9
minutes.
All right, well, this could be our last, I don't know. So there's some questions about transparency. So transparency's come up a bunch of times. There's several questions in here, and in the top few questions around transparency. A couple of them related to transparency goes both ways, right? As the way this question is phrased. So explain how things like non-GMO water or things that are labeled non-GMO for which there are no GMO versions available are actually transparency, and are they in fact really more just another profit, another profit opportunity, another marketing choice that companies are making, and not really bringing true transparency?
I will guarantee this is gluten-free water.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll let somebody else go since I just went.
Anyone
I
else?
think it begs the question.
Can I,
Oh, sure.
Tom?
Oh.
Were you?
Our community is, or the more fanatical elements in our community, the organic community, have spent a tremendous amount of money and time and resources on the labeling issue and on opposing GMOs. I think it's very clear that many people in society want to know whether there have been recombinant technologies used in the foods that they eat. Most of us are eating the heck out of them already anyhow, unknowingly. But it is unfair, whether their fears are rational or irrational, not to have them inform as to what they're eating. If they want to be involved in the experiment, they can opt in. If they don't want to be involved in the experiment, they can opt out. And I think that's one of the issues that has, given the biotechnology industry a black eye and a bad name amongst the public, is that they're secretive. And so we shouldn't be secretive. We should be open. We should be telling people what we're doing with their food. And we should be, if we think we got a great product, we should be selling it to them. But not by telling them that the water's gluten-free. Telling them more truthful things.
Sorry, I know they cut you off before, Dana.
No,
Sorry.
Sorry, I jumped in. I mean, another framework that we don't use in this country, if there is an overabundance of labeling, I have seen gluten-free labeled carrots, and so we do see it happen. But in our structure, we are asking the companies that are GMO-free to label if they're GMO-free. We could flip that. What if companies who are using genetically engineered ingredients label this is using genetically engineered ingredients? That includes CRISPR. That includes gene editing, right? Let's not get into the dirty details of is a GMO, does a GMO count as genetic engineering? Is CRISPR a GMO, right? Genetic engineering to a consumer is genetic engineering. And to dice and splice is hard, but if labeling every single thing as non-GMO is a problem, then let's flip it.
Well, we will have an opportunity to see how that works out in the next year, right?
What do you think?
Mike, this issue of transparency from our perspective, this is not specific to biotechnology, right? Transparency, the driver of transparency is not biotechnology. We see an expectation around transparency in the food system across all forms of agriculture, organic, non-GM, GM, all types of food systems. And so, I don't want the audience to get the impression that the whole discussion around transparency in food is around biotechnology. It's not, right? It's a bigger shift. It's a paradigm shift with consumers, and I think that's the important thing to recognize. This is not strictly about biotechnology.
Yeah, great. Paul?
Yeah, I agree with Randy. It's not just about biotech. I mean, you could envision a movement someday to say, I want to go back to what Tom was saying, I want my products labeled with what pesticides were used on them, for example. I'm not proposing that, but one could see that arising at some point as well. But I think on a broader point, going to the transparency issue, think about what's happening in the meat industry today. So the meat industry has been subjected to a number of animal welfare exposés that have led to slaughter plant shutdowns, lots of media attention, sometimes criminal animal cruelty convictions, and more. And much of the industry's response has not been to try to prevent the abuses that are being uncovered from taking place, but rather it has been to try to prevent people from finding out about those abuses in the first place by pursuing what are commonly referred to as ag-gag laws, bills that make it illegal not to abuse the animal, but to take a photo or a video of somebody abusing the animal. And they've succeeded in a number of states in passing these laws. 2 of them have so far been struck down as unconstitutional in Idaho and Utah, but other states still have them on the books. And that is sending a message to the public that there is something that is being hidden. If you want to make it a crime just to take a photo of what an industry is doing, it sends a big red flag. Contrast that, let's say, with the clean meat industry, where you will essentially have breweries making meat that you can go tour anytime you want. Maybe they'll be live streamed to the public, and you can go tour it at your friendly neighborhood.
That is not going to be a big seller. I'm just pointing out. So for Hollywood guys.
You go to your neighborhood, maybe you go to your local friendly neighborhood meat brewery. Who knows? But you'll be able to see how your meat is produced, because right now people eat meat not because of how it's produced, but really often in spite of how it's produced. And when you have this new industry, I think that you'll have much greater transparency from the protein producers, who I predict will probably be a lot of the same companies making meat the way it's made today.
Yeah, well, they're certainly investing in it.
They are certainly investing in it.
So we're just about out of time. I do want to acknowledge that what has persistently been the top question, which I did not ask, is directed to you, Dana. The reason I'm not asking you this is because I find it to be more of a statement than a question. It does raise some questions about your discussion of Impossible Burger and the GRAS determination, and that is not the same thing as saying that it is unsafe. And so I want to put that out there because I know a lot of people have voted on that as a question, but it's not really a question.
I've eaten the Impossible Burger many times, and I'm still here.
Okay.
So we got time to do a little roundup or what?
Yeah, I think we really have like 1 minute. So I think instead of, I don't think we have time to do a real roundup. If you have a burning last statement that you would like to make, please do.
Well, I would. I mean, we recently entered what was a new geological age. It's called the Anthropocene. That means that the activities of human beings are the overwhelming force driving change in life systems and even the geology of the planet. So our species is piloting spaceship Earth. I don't know if we have a driver's license. Don't think we necessarily do, but Stuart Brand, who came out with the new Earth, the whole Earth catalog back in 1968 is quoted as saying, if we are as gods, we better start getting good at it. So, no white hat farmers and black hat farmers. If you eat food, you are a farmer. If he or I can't grow it for you, you will go out and grow it yourself. So let's bring the best of all these technologies together, take agriculture where it needs to go. Thanks.
All right, I think on that note, we end. So please thank the panel.